Hello and welcome. Thanks for attending today's ODWC Ask an Angler. We're here today to talk about our new bass rule that goes into effect on this Sunday, September 11th. Basically, what this new bass rule is entailing is it's changing what the daily size limit is on fish that have typically been a 14-inch minimum for your 6 daily limit. So doesn't change the daily as far as how many fish you can keep and keep 6 fish still. It just changes the sizes in which you can now keep. So prior to this rule, it was a 14-inch minimum. So that meant you could keep 6 fish and they had to be at least 14 inches for our largemouth and smallmouth bass when they were in ponds, lakes, reservoirs, anything other than our streams. Those have special restrictions on them to help protect smallmouth bass in their native habitats. So really what this rule is designed to do is to enhance our bass fisheries. So, most people, when they go fishing, especially our sport fishermen, they're looking to catch some bigger fish. And in order to do that, you have to have a healthy size population with these fish. And so really, this is an opportunity for people to be able to catch and keep a lot of fish that they most commonly catch anyways. Fish under 16 inches are, going to be the primary catch that you're going to have for most anglers who go out, whether or not you're throwing bait or you're throwing, artificial lures, flies, things like that. Most of the time you're catching fish that are under 16 inches on average. So what this rule does is it's going to allow for us to be able to harvest these fish, which is great for the angler, people who like fish. You're going to be able to get to keep and catch your bass now. And in doing so, as that kind of transpires over the course of the next several years, we're going to start to see improvements on lakes, pond. If you own your own pond, if you lease a pond, neighborhood pond, close to home fishery, any kind of small body of water, you're really going to start to notice a difference. If there's good harvest and kind of a good structure behind that, and we'll get into that. Again, these Asking Anglers are always meant to be conversational. Please use the chat bar at any time to ask questions as we go along. We're going to kind of go through the whole gamut of largemouth bass today. So while the rule also applies to smallmouth bass, that's not really kind of the whole background behind the rule. Smallmouth bass in Oklahoma, in our lakes and reservoirs, they're not native. Our native strains of smallmouth hang out in our eastern streams, and they don't really have a penchant for moving into those reservoirs as they've been impounded. So the smallmouth bass that you catch in lakes and reservoirs across the state, those are going to be northern strain, typically referred to as Tennessee strain smallmouth, and they've been stocked. So not as many of them as there are largemouth bass. So those bass have always kind of been lumped together as far as your daily catch. So this course is really designed for the largemouth bass, which are native. We do stock Florida strain that mix with our northern strain largemouth that are native here to kind of help with their potential growth. And we're going to talk about how this rule really helps with, allowing these fish to hopefully be able to maximize those growth potentials that they have within their genetics and the bodies of water that they live in. So basically what happens with fish. So we'll start with kind of like a pond. Let's say you own your own pond or you fish, you have a deer hunting lease or, some type of lease of land, family land. It's got, pond on it, it's got bass in it. So what you're dealing with in that pond, let's say anything under 5 acres. Most people's ponds are going to run somewhere between a 1/4 acre up to about 2 acre. That's going to be your average size pond. There's some that are a little bit bigger, some that are a little smaller, but for the most part, a decent bass fishery in a pond is going to be something that's about a 1/2 acre or bigger and kind of under, 2 acres, somewhere in there. And it's really easy for the person who owns the pond or somebody who fishes the pond to help manage those, to help yourself not only be able to catch more fish, keep your fish healthier, but it will allow for the genetics that are in your pond to really reach their full potential by particularly harvesting fish that are under 16 inches, which is what this new rule now allows for. So when you have fish that are in your pond or your lake or your reservoir, whatever it may be, as they grow, their fastest growth from from the time that they, are hatched in their eggs as fry until they get all the way up to a state record fish, they really grow the fastest in those first few years. And that is a biological defense mechanism to help them from getting predated. The smaller they are, the easier they are for lots of different things to eat. As they get bigger, becomes more difficult for them to be predated on by other fish, other aquatic predators, avian predators like owls and hawks, egrets and otters, beavers, anything, turtles, anything that may eat a fish. The bigger they get, harder it is to predate on them. So these fish grow their fastest in those first few years of life to hopefully get themselves to a place where, they can kind of try to live out their life cycle. But what happens is when you have a spawn class, so when these fish go up and they spawn, they spawn in the millions. There's millions of fry that will hatch. Very few, a very, very small percentage of those fish will ever make it to adulthood for any number of reasons. But as they start to get into that kind of 3-inch range, up to 6 inches, and then up to 10 inches, when they get in that, it gets very competitive for prey. So their food source, it becomes very competitive. A bigger largemouth bass that is 14 plus inches on, you're starting to look at a pound, 2 pound, 3, 4 pound bass. Well, their mouths all of a sudden go from being about this to getting up to something like this on a fish that is, only 3 or 4 pounds. It is able to really take advantage of if there's a low prey source. They can eat bluegill, they can eat frogs, they can eat snakes. Some bigger fish will even eat ducklings, all types of bugs and aquatic invertebrates. What happens is that when you get too many fish that are the similar size, which for largemouth bass, that's going to be somewhere in between about 6 and 14 inches, depending on the body of water and all that. But that's really going to be where you're going to see the most abundance of that species in that body of water. And so they obviously have similarly sized mouths. Well, they can only eat a very particular size prey base. So they're all preying on that same resource. And if you get too many fish, especially in smaller bodies of water where they're not able to maybe go find, a nice creek arm of a reservoir that might have a better food source, that's going to allow for fish to kind of naturally grow out on a bigger body of water. You can still run into some prey problems, but it's far less problematic on big reservoirs. You really see issues with the health of your largemouth bass, the size structure, when you start getting into those smaller lakes and impoundments. And then especially like your farm pond or your, whatever pond you have, neighborhood pond, things like that, where, they're confined to a very small area. So the resources then become more scarce and they're competing against each other. So as you're able to start culling out those fish, it allows them to continue to grow in that kind of fast rate in their first few years of life and help them not get stressed out. When prey sources are lacking, fish start to develop bad feeding habits. They start to get stressed out. All of that affects their genetics. It affects their ability to reproduce. It affects, everything about them. And in turn, it also has negative effects elsewhere within the body of water, because if you have the same predator at the same size and it's eating all of the same size, bait fish or crayfish or bugs, you're also going to see some problems elsewhere within the ecological structure of that body of water. So it's really important, as anglers, especially, most ponds and lakes in Oklahoma, and they're all not natural. So we've dammed bodies of water, which were creeks and streams and rivers, where all of our native fish, like the northern strain largemouth bass, all of your sunfish species, your crappie, your catfish, where they learned how to live and survive. So there was always a balance. They were always able to balance themselves out because of that. When you build a confined space for these fish, all of a sudden it changes the dynamics of that competition. And you can run into things of, if you stock your pond or you overstock, there's just lots of ways, good recruit class year for spawning, where you're just, there's no natural predation to kind of even out that balance. And so that's what we see, within our fisheries across the state. And most of them are in pretty good shape. But then with additional stockings of fish, you can run into things with introducing species like a hybrid striped bass or a striped bass, sockeye, anything like that, walleye, all predators, all are having an effect on the ecosystem in one way or another, even though they may be eating different prey sources. By depleting one prey source, you're ultimately hurting your food chain at some point. So that's really kind of the very not super scientific reasoning behind what this rule is. And it is to eventually help people, especially people who own their own bodies of water, your own small lake, your own pond, and then our smaller bodies of water, our public bodies of water that people, you may not have access to a private body of water. So you're going out to a public lake, and a lot of people, you want the opportunity to be able to catch that trophy fish. And in order to get to that point where that becomes more prevalent, we have to start harvesting our largemouth bass that are under 16 inches. And there's lots of background on why people don't typically harvest bass. Even when we had a 14-inch minimum, 14 inches are great fish to pull out. You're going to get a lot of fish that are going to get right there around that 14-inch mark, and they're good fish to cull as well. But over the years with professional bass fishing tournaments, bass pros, there's been this ingrained element within the culture of fishing that you don't eat largemouth bass. You don't keep them. By throwing them back, by throwing all of them back, you're somehow going to enhance your fishery. Well, when you're turning loose 8-10 inchers that you're catching, when you have the opportunity now to harvest them, you're really putting more stress and strain on that body of water than you are. That fish is going to grow up to be a 10-pound fish that you can, take a great picture of or hang up on your wall someday. That's just kind of not how that dynamic works. So this new rule is hopefully going to allow for what up until the 1950s and 60s was especially in places like Oklahoma, it was very prevalent to eat bass. You'd find bass on the lunch table, on the dinner table. There was no stigma behind eating bass. And as professional bass fishing kind of got up and started in the late 60s and early 70s, and then really gained some traction going into the 80s with advents of things like the bass boat and electronics and all of this, it became very competitive, and you just kind of got this stigma of catch and release that is stuck. So we're hoping with this new rule, that not only are we going to see good biological benefits, but at the end of the day, we're going to also turn people on to the fact that bass are delicious. If you like crappie, if you like sunfish, if you like catfish, you're going to love to eat largemouth bass. They're a white fish. You get nice fillets off of them. They're super easy to catch. They're super easy to clean. Fishing for food or, just fishing for a fish fry, anything like that. There's lots of different ways to cook them, but you really get that nice, perfect fillet that you don't necessarily get off of a crappie that's the same size or off of a sunfish that's the same size. Sometimes even a channel cat or a blue cat that might be around the same size. So you really get a great meal out of largemouth bass that are in that 8 to 14 inch range, which is through years and years of surveys and studies of Oklahoma bodies of water. That is the most abundant size class of fish that you're going to find in most bodies of water, especially the smaller lakes. You're going to see the majority of largemouth bass that exist in that body of water are going to be between 8 and 14 inches. So hopefully we can get some more people eating bass starting on Sunday, being able to get out there. And then for those who, you own your own pond, or you own your own small lake, or maybe you are in a neighborhood pond where you're able to, have management strategies with your neighbors who like to fish. Per acre, you're looking to harvest somewhere between 20 and 35 pounds of bass a year. So if you were keeping, 1 pounders, which are going to be somewhere in that 12 to 14 inch range, or half pounders that are going to be in that 8 to 12 inch range, you add that up, you go out and a few weekends a year, especially, it's really good to do it in the fall. We're in a great time of year. In my opinion, this is the best time of year to bass fish that we're coming up on, as our water temps are starting to cool, shorter days, less aquatic vegetation, things like that. Bass become easier to catch. That water gets a little bit colder, so they kind of start to firm up again. You catch bass in the summertime, especially in smaller bodies of water where that water is really hot. You're going to notice a difference in the firmness of the texture of the fish itself and then of the meat just from being in that warmer water. So as we get into these cooler nights, cooler overnight lows, less sun on the water, moving into October, your fish are going to come right back into their really, really healthy, got to eat before winter. It's a great time of year to fish, and it's a great time of year to practice catching and keeping bass, on this first year of this new rule. So with that, we're going to kind of talk about, how to catch, bass. You can targeting smaller fish is not as difficult as targeting larger fish. Obviously, if you're targeting just big fish and you're throwing lures or baits or flies that are of a size in which a smaller fish can't possibly inhale it, well, then you're limiting that. Now, if you throw smaller baits, which is what we're going to talk about today, which are mostly size profiles that are going to be 3 inches and under, maybe up to about 4 inches. And that's going to put you in the best opportunity to catch the most amount of bass, no matter where you go. But you're not going to eliminate your opportunity to catch a big fish. I mean, a big fish can eat anything. A small fish can't eat anything. So you could throw a 1 inch, little fly or grub, or have a little piece of night crawler or red worm or a cricket on a hook. You can still catch an 8-pound bass. Nothing's preventing them from getting that. But you are going to be targeting certain areas that are more likely to have that range of fish that we're looking to harvest, especially, like I said, if you own your own pond, or you fish a lake that is a smaller lake that maybe you've noticed over the years a decline in possibly your sunfish population or your crappie population or anything like that. Once you start to get these bass in a certain size range, you're really going to start to see the dynamics shift of what the prey base is and then what all the other species are. Because for largemouth bass, one of their favorite meals is going to be bluegill. And so what you'll end up with is you can end up with a pond or a small lake that's got really big bluegill in it or really big red ear sunfish, hybrid sunfish. And once they get to a certain size, they can no longer be eaten by these bass that the majority of them are in that 8 to 14 inch range. But what you will see is that over time, you will start to lose your bluegill population or your, any type of sunfish population, because those bass are going to heavily predate on those sunfish when they go to spawn, because they're going to have, sunfish fry. And those bass, that's going to be one of the main meals that they're going to be able to get into, because you don't have a good size structure of fish eating a multitude of different types of prey sources. It may even be the same type of prey source, but they're eating it in different sizes of those prey. And it just allows for a much better balance and allows most of these species and the ecology of that body of water to really reach what its full potential can be. So with that, like I said, anytime during this, please feel free, throw questions into the chat bar. If something, you think of something, or I'm moving too fast through a bait or a lure, or move through a subject too fast, these are meant to be conversational. We're just going to kind of go through all of the artificial lures first, and then we'll talk about some bait and flies, and then we'll talk about some cleaning tips, some cooking tips, the best public destinations in the state to go fish that our fisheries division has identified as areas that have an overabundance of what we consider either a stunted bass or at least bass that are unable to really reach their maximum growth potential because there's too many of them of the same size, and they're out competing each other and everything else, and they get kind of stuck in that range. You may have received an email that had the similar subject matter on Tuesday that had our guide. It's over in the chat bar for anybody. You can click on that link, and it's going to have a lot of what we're discussing. If you got to hop off or anything like that. And then these videos are always available to watch immediately after this course is over with, through our Ask an Angler playlist through our Outdoor Oklahoma YouTube channel. So videos are always available. If you have to hop off for any reason or you miss a segment or something like that, you can always come back and watch it here right after we're done. So I'm going to start out with hard baits, and we'll work our way kind of towards the soft plastics of our artificials and what we're looking for to really target. So, at this time of year, We're coming out of that summer heat where fishing has been difficult already because it's hot. We've had an exceptionally hot summer with very little rainfall, kind of put us back into that drought stage again in most parts of the state. So most anglers across the state, whether you fish a pond, city lake, even some of our reservoirs, you're going to notice that they're pretty low, and that causes fish to be stressed out. Water gets hot. So what's typically a difficult time of year this summer has been exceptionally difficult on most bodies of water, really, to get out there and kind of target largemouth bass. And what they like to do after they come out of their spawn in the spring is water gets warmer, light cycle, sun's up longer. You start to see a lot of aquatic vegetative growth on most bodies of water. Not all bodies of water can support vegetative growth. And typically in those types of bodies of water, it's actually a little bit easier to catch bass throughout the course of the year, as opposed to areas that get really heavy vegetative growth, whether it's grass, hydrilla, lily pads, anything that provides really dense, thick cover, especially in water that, may get out to 8, 10, 12 feet. If the water's clear enough to have some vegetative growth, those bass are just going to suck right into that all summer long and, feast on whatever they can get a hold of without expending too much energy as that water temp warms up. As we get into the fall, fish are kind of inclined to, they get very lethargic in the winter as those water temps drop down into the 50s, low 50s, into the 40s, and in some cases even into the 30s. Those fish go into, what is kind of an active hibernation where they may only feed once a day or, once in a while, and they're conserving as much energy as possible. So in order to do so and stay in the best shape that they can, they really kind of go into what a lot of people call a fall gorge. And that is where they are almost exclusively targeting fish. So they're going after shad, they're going after bluegill, they're going after crappie. As the summer has worn on, all of those fry from last spring, especially bluegill, they're going to be getting to a size about like this as they're growing. And that's going to be a very prevalent prey source for those largemouth bass. There's no longer the thick, dense vegetative cover for those bait fish to hide in. Those largemouth will take advantage of the fact that they have open water where bait fish don't have as many places to hide anymore without that dense vegetative cover. So when you're looking to target bass in the fall, you're really looking, you kind of start to move away from a lot of the soft plastics that you might use during the spawn, post spawn, in those late spring months, early summer, couple of weeks, where you're targeting them with, soft plastics like brush hogs and lizards, terrestrial type, big long stick worms that may look like a snake, where they really start to key in on that. And that's great when there's that vegetative growth. But as we get into the fall and we start to lose that, they really start to key back in on, any type of a bait fish. So, and that's going to vary from where you're at. And so what you're throwing may change. If you're in your own pond or you're in a neighborhood pond, odds are you probably don't have shad. Not to say you don't, but more than likely their primary prey fish is going to be some type of fathead minnow, golden shiner, and then bluegill. So your patterns that you're looking to mimic in that body of water you're going to want to reflect for that. Now, if you're out on the big reservoir or you're in a lake that does have our shad populations of threadfin and gizzard, then your playbook might open up a little bit more for what you can throw, because those fish are going to be keying in on shad that are moving in schools. They're also going to, not pass up the opportunity to go after bluegill. So you can kind of throw some wider range of baits that you're going to find the most amount of success with on a given day. So with the hard baits, we'll start with some top water. So early morning hours, and really as we get into the fall, you might see active surface feeding throughout the course of the day, depending on where bass are pushing bait fish around. If they can push them into the back of a cove, if they can push them up onto like a wind-driven point or bank where they really kind of have them pinned, throwing top water throughout the course of the day is going to yield, strikes, just depending on what they're going after. It could be a bluegill pattern. You still are even going to have your terrestrials that are in play, like frogs. It's still going to be another month or so before you really start to see your frog presence start to dwindle down as the water gets colder and air temps get colder, and those, amphibians and reptiles really start to get ready for the winter, and they're not as prevalent on the water. So With topwater, again, we're trying to target bass that are under 16 inches. So we don't want to be throwing 4, 5, 6, 7 inch topwater baits, or any baits for that matter. We really want to try to stick in kind of the 2 to 4 inch range with whatever we're throwing. But ideally, about 3 inches is a good happy medium, because you're still going to have the opportunity to catch big fish on that. You're going to attract that type of attention, but you're going to be able to catch 6, 8, 10 inch fish with ease that will come up to grab a bait of that size. So whether you're on a pond or out on the lake, big reservoir, baits that are going to create some surface disruption. So as we go into the fall with schooling or boiling, bait fish, especially shad that are moving through the top of the water column in those morning and evening hours in that shallower water, things that have like propellers or blades on them that are going to kind of create that gurgle that will happen as bait fish get spooked up onto the top and they start creating surface disruptions. So real good ones to look for your top water, especially with hard top water baits, are going to be things like a whopper plopper or a Berkeley Chopo, something that is like this. These come in all different types of patterns. If you happen to be fishing in, out on any lake or reservoir, this is just a very basic shad imitation. We have our silver body, our dark back, our quintessential shad dot. And then as you just retrieve these in, that's going to spin and it's going to create just a little bit of a wake and a gurgle. And throwing these in the backs of coves, out along wind-driven points, wind-driven banks, morning and evening hours especially. But this is going to get you a lot of fish. You're going to get a lot of strikes on something like this in most bodies of water where you've got good top water action. And you're going to get a lot of crossover bites, especially on bigger bodies of water where you may have striped bass, hybrid striped bass, white bass. You're going to get a lot of fish to come up and serve it for these. You can even get sunfish that will come up and hit the backs of these. So this is a really good topwater bait. The technology that's evolved over the years with artificial lures, things like this, have come a long ways from your more traditional propeller bait, which is essentially this accomplishing the same thing. This is a much more subtle profile. These are great, I think, in ponds, smaller bodies of water, especially if they get a lot of pressure. This is going to create a lot more surface disruption than just a basic Hedon torpedo that's got its little propeller on the back. But these are going to be good shad imitating bait. So on bodies of water where bass are really keying in on shad, which is typically going to be on wind-driven sides of a body of water, up against a dam, up against points, up against, the backs of those coves or creek arms, as those shad get back in there, a color like this is going to work really well out on your bigger water. Now, if you're fishing your small city lake, or you're fishing your neighborhood pond, your own pond, you might have some shiners. You're obviously going to have a lot of bluegill, frogs, things of that nature. So here's a good golden shiner imitator of that Berkeley Chopo. And this is going to be dynamite if you have a pond or a lake that's got golden shiners in them. It's really hard to beat this, especially in those low light hours. This is just going to give off a lot of good coloration. And with this kind of golden color in the dark back, this is going to do a great job of not only dead awning your golden shiners, but it's also going to mimic a bluegill or a frog. You're getting a lot of the same colors out of this bait. So when you're fishing on your pond or your smaller body of water, looking for more of those natural colors that aren't so shad, that those fish are typically used to seeing on a daily basis. You can also use walk the dog lures, which are going to be your long, slender shaped baits. Get these unwrapped here. A few different colors, just a bone white, and then more of our shad and minnow, kind of ghost minnow colors. These are going to be great on, again, bodies of water, your bigger bodies of water, especially along wind-blown sides. They don't have any. They have some rattles in them, but outside of that, it's just a very subtle profile on the top. You're going to catch in bodies of water that have white bass and hybrid striped bass. You're going to catch a lot more of them, especially if you get on schools of them. But again, focusing at this time of year for largemouth bass in particular, looking for that sheltered water that bait fish have stacked up into that have now lost their cover. So marinas, backs of coves, creek arms. If you're on a small pond, anything along the bank. Those fit, you're going to have bass that are sitting in any given area in water that's going to be anywhere, depending on, depth relativity. They could be in 1 foot of water up to 8 feet of water, just depending on how your bank is and things like that. But for largemouth bass in particular, with our top water, especially at this time of year, you want to be targeting that shallow sheltered water, especially if there's been a wind that's blown that direction. It's going to push a lot more prey source back in those types of areas. But these are all good size profiles. This Chapo right here, this is going to be 3 inches. Good rule of thumb is always, is your lure bigger than your index finger? Everybody's hands are different sizes, but for the most part, unless you are a 7-foot basketball player, odds are your finger or hand. This is going to be a good measuring tool. Is your lure the size of your finger, a little bit smaller? That's going to be your perfect bait profile for this time of year and for catching the types of fish that we're trying to target, which is under that 16 inches. And really, we're looking to try to target fish, especially to eat, really that 8 to 14 inch range. Once you start to hit the 14 to 16 inch in that range, you're starting to get into fish that could be anywhere between 2 and 4 pounds, depending on how much it's eating. And for your really good kind of cooking, however you like to cook them, whether it's chunk them up, throw them into bites, fry them as whole strips, pan sear them, grill them, as a whole fillet, you're going to get really some nice meat and fillets off of the fish that are in that 18 to 14 inch range. And those are also going to be the fish that are the most willing to bite, especially on some of these smaller, lure profiles that we're going to show. You could go like, these are a really good torpedo. This is just your 1 7/8 inches, but something that's going to give you kind of that frog, crawfish, bluegill pattern, and then shad when you're out, out on your water that has those types. You could try poppers. You're going to have your poppers. You're going to have some different types of topwater baits that you might find success with. The really only other one at this time of year, now again, you can throw frogs. Frogs are going to be great, especially in smaller bodies of water. But even with the small frog, you can still bring up a pretty big fish. So hollow bodied frogs are great. A little bit harder to catch smaller fish on these hollow bodied frogs. It's not that big of a bait profile, but our hook points up on the top and that hollow body, that fish has to get its mouth up and over. And when they do that and they bite down on it, it exposes those hook points. A lot more difficult with our smaller fish, smaller mouth to get up because they have to get inside of it. So you're more apt at catching more fish if you're going to use something that has treble hooks on it. You're going to get a lot more value out of utilizing treble hooks. So jitterbugs, great bait for lakes or ponds, especially a dark color like this. You're going to get a lot of different things that this is going to mimic. But by having dual trebles or even just one treble hook, when fish come up to swing at it, especially those smaller fish, they're still bound to get a face full of treble hook. Even if only one point ends up inside the mouth, the face plate right there, you're more likely to get hooked up on something like this than you are with this. You can get just as many strikes, but the odds of hooking up go way down with like hollow bodied frogs or singular point topwater baits. So if you're thinking of throwing topwater, even like a little hula popper, we still have that one treble hook, which is going to go a long ways, or another jitterbug and more of that frog color. So if you're thinking topwater, rattle frogs, frog poppers, rebel crickets, anything, that's those basic, get them at Walmart, get them at Bass Pro, local bait shop, real cheap topwaters, your rebels, the things that are like $1.99, $2.99 that are going to have treble hooks on them. Those are going to be your biggest value for being able to get the most success in hooking up, even when you're getting the strikes. Because you might get strikes, but you're just not as likely to hook up. And that kind of leads me to the next real good kind of topwater bait, especially in bigger reservoirs, is going to be your buzz baits up on the top. But again, we're dealing with singular points on the back. So whites, chartreuses, things like this. This is a big profile bait with everything that's going on, but the actual bait itself that's sitting just below the surface, as this blade is running across the top, creating that surface activity, getting fish interested. Maybe you're throwing this right into a school of surfacing fish or a bait fish that you can see up on top. These are going to be great. Chartreuse and whites and reds. You might switch it up. You can go with the darker colors when you're on smaller bodies of water, especially if they're clear. But if you're out on the big reservoir or something like that, these in the backs of coves, you're going to draw strikes. But again, singular point all the way at the back of the lure. Fish has got to be able to get up, get over that, and make a clean strike. Fish will come out any angle, typically from behind and from below. But if they take a side swipe at it, they might grab all of this and they'll still miss that hook point. So treble hooks are really going to get you on more hookups. Who makes these buzz baits? There is a whole smattering of different types of buzz baits in here. Some of these are Strike King. Some of these are just like generic Bass Pro, but there's some spinner baits in here, and then our buzz baits over here. But whites to darks, keeping with the single blades, but stick with treble hooks if you want to get hooked up more often. They can hit them from a lot of different angles and you'll still find success. Other hard baits that you can kind of run across the top, spinner baits, again, are great at this time of year as they're targeting those bait sources, but very basic colors. Chartreuses, whites and blues, maybe even add a trailer to them, burn them fast across the top in the early morning hours. You can fish them essentially like a top water. You're getting them just below the surface of the water, getting that blade to spin. And as opposed to creating that surface disruption, you're still just, burning those in the backs of coves. So those are good top water and a hard bait to kind of fish like a top water. All right, so that takes us through all of the top water that I have. Some less common hard baits that you can use: spoons and Castmasters. Anything that's got flash and looks like a bait fish. Really, you're just looking to something to toss out there. So early morning hours, as we're moving into the middle of the day, fish might suck out just a little bit deeper into those coves, or kind of hunker down closer to the bottom. They stop coming up as much. That sun gets up again. Fish are ingrained. Stay away from the top of the water when there's lots of avian predators, and those bait fish will start to suck down into deeper water and settle down as we get farther into daylight. So when we get to that point, then it kind of opens everything else. Everything that's subsurface, what are you looking to find success with? But you still want to stick to the same areas. Unlike the times of year in the spring or the summer where a lot of fishing offshore, this is a great time of year for anybody who has access to water. You don't need a boat, you don't need a kayak or a float. If you have that, great. But if you don't, you're at no disadvantage to catching just as many bass, and especially the size range of bass that we're looking to harvest. So any type of public access at a marina, cove, park, where you have access to shoreline, you're going to be just fine. And so hard baits that, something with a little bit of flash, kind of the rule of thumb is that if you have cloudy water, muddy or cloudy, something that's, not your typical, like just a little dinge, but there's still water clarity. Chartreuses, whites and chartreuses are going to always be your best bet in that kind of cloudy or milkier water. When you have clearer water or relatively clear water, you're going to get away with whites and chartreuses. You're still going to get bit, but you're better off going with more natural earth colors, green pumpkins, browns, blacks, blues, reds, purples, things like that are going to be in those types of water. But trout anglers, things like that, maybe you don't have a lot of bass gear, but you want to go try to catch yourself some bass. If you have some spoons, small spoons or Castmaster slabs, you're going to find success with those. They're going to do a great job of mimicking small bait fish. And the size fish that are perfect to catch, those 10 inchers, 10, 12-inch bass, those are my favorite. If you can go into your pond, you can clean fish out. Those are going to be, good crappie size. Good crappie is going to be right there in that 10 to 12 inch range, 10 to 14 inches. 14-inch crappie is pretty big, but that 10 to 12 inch range is where you kind of stick with lots of the fish that most people are used to filleting anyways. Your sunfish are going to be in that, you're trying to keep sunfish in the 7 to 10 inch range and bigger. Crappie, you're looking at that 8 to 12 inch range for most of the fish that you're catching and filleting. Well, a bass that's that size is going to yield 2 or 3 times more meat. It's just got a better fillet, the way that it's designed, elongated as opposed to being more of a round where, the meat is going to taper off as it gets to the tail with those panfish. With the bass, they're going to have more of a fillet from right where you cut behind the faceplate all the way down to the tail. It's going to taper down a little bit, but you're still going to get a nicer fillet out of that. So those 10, 12 inch bass are really just kind of the perfect wheelhouse for fish that you're looking to clean. And any type of small, flashy bait is going to draw the attention of largemouth bass, especially as we get later into September, especially all of October, depending on how quick we get cold and how cold we get going into November. Sometimes the fall fishing window, if we drop temps really good in September, but then kind of stagger through October with 70s, maybe 80s, but overnight lows that are starting to get down. Maybe a north wind comes through, we get a couple of high 40s, low 50s. Gives you a nice gradual drop, also starts to take that vegetative cover away. And you can get a really good fall fishing window that could be up to about 8 weeks of really, really good fishing. And even on a year where it goes straight from hot to cold, you're still going to get a pretty good 2 to 3 week window in there where fishing is going to be really good. So other things that you might have in a trout box or a little panfish box, super dupers, just a little open face, shaved piece of metal. Silver, if you have a pond that's got shiners in it, you can go with a gold. They make these in 3 different sizes for the most part, and 500, 501, and 502. All going to work great. Little light action rod. These are great in ponds. You're going to catch a lot of bass with them. The bigger water, you might get into more species. You can catch a white bass and panfish, crappie. Pretty much anything that's looking to eat small bait fish, super dupers, spoons, and blades. Very basic, cheap bait that you can buy for a hard bait. Going to get a lot of durability, and it's a multi-species bait. So not only can you catch fish in the fall for largemouth, but you're going to be able to use those in the wintertime for trout. Then you're going to be able to use them again in the springtime for things like white bass and crappie. So really good multi-purpose bait. So most of our traditional hard baits that are going to be subsurface are going to be your jerk baits, your lipless crankbaits, and your lipped crankbaits. At this time of year, we're looking for good access to the water. So it's going to be, backs of coves, round the points, ponds that you can walk around. So we don't need to go super deep. So 1 to 5 foot diving baits are going to be great. 1/8 ounce up to a 1/4 ounce lipless crankbait. 1/2 ounce is going to be a little bit too heavy. You're going to have to burn it a little too fast. With those largemouth bass, they're less likely to take a hard run at a fast moving bait than your temperate bass species, like a white bass or a hybrid striped bass or a striper that you just can't outrun. You can't outreel them. They're going to come get that. Largemouth bass, you're looking for more of a slow to steady retrieve. Is going to get you bit more often than not. They're ambush predators. So even when they are actively chasing bait fish around, they typically will kind of settle and then they'll wait and then they'll come back in. So when you can run something near where largemouth are sitting, it doesn't need to be super slow. You want to get a little bit of reactionary bite because, if the water's clear enough, they may get a really good look at your bait. If you're retrieving too slow and it isn't what they're looking for, they may be less inclined to take a swipe at it. You want it to be going just a medium retrieve is going to be great with any of these baits. So 1/4 ounce out on bigger water or reservoir, if you're dropping out into 8-10 feet when you're casting, then a 1/4 ounce is fine because you really want to kind of let that thing get down middle of the water column. And then as you're reeling back uphill into yourself, as the coming up into the bank and your water level is going like this, and those fish are going to be sitting on points of structure. They've lost their vegetative cover. So they're looking for things like boulders, ledges, stumps, sticks, anything that can just give them a little bit of concealment to wait, looking upward to get unsuspecting, prey that's going to swim over the top of them. So lipless crankbaits, 1/4 ounce is going to be fine, and you're going to be able to retrieve that. Start getting heavier than that, you're going to be having problems running with the bottom. And then if you're reeling fast enough to keep it off the bottom, you're probably reeling too fast to really get a lot of strikes. And your bait profile has gone way up, so you're more apt to hook into a big fish as opposed to getting right in those kind of cookie cutter size fish that we're looking for. So with our lipless crankbaits, these are all big crankbaits. So these are all 1/2 ounce crankbaits. 1/4 ounce is about the same profile. Well, we'll show this just because there's some pretty good colors in here. Crawfish patterns are always good. Reds, anything with red and brown in it, always going to be a good largemouth bass color. But purple back, anything that's got some purple in it, it's always going to be really good. You get that iridescent flash of those bluegill. And then, they make lifelike imitations now of bluegill type patterns, something like that. But these are all 1/2 ounce baits. These are going to be a little bit too heavy. Great though for when we get back into the winter, late winter, February, going into March. These are going to be dynamite for some bigger bass when you get to that time of year when we're trying to target those types of bass. So we really want to be sticking in that 1/4 ounce to 1/8 ounce range, which for the most part, your 1/8 ounce baits are going to be a lot smaller. There's going to be a big noticeable difference, and that's really where I like to stay in, especially when I go out and fish reservoirs from the bank. So if I'm fishing on a dam or a cove that I can get into, I really like an 1/8 ounce silver rattle trap. This is kind of my go-to for my multi-species, but I do catch a lot of bass on these. And so very small compared to our other ones. You don't notice much of a difference in size structure between the 1/2 ounce and a 1/4 ounce, but your 1/8 ounce is really almost shrinking your 1/4 ounce in half as far as the size structure goes. But it's still an 1/8 of an ounce. So it's not a 16th, it's not a 32nd. These are great for bigger water because that 1/8 of an ounce is a really good weight to get down into that 4 to 6 foot range and then be able to bring it up into your shallow 1 to 4 foot range without having to overburn it. So this is of all the lipless crankbaits, this is always my favorite. I always find myself coming back to just an 1/8 ounce basic silver black back rattle trap. Different brands, Crane, Bass Pro makes their own generic model. There's lots of lipless crankbaits out there, but just the original Bill Lewis rattle trap, this 1/8 ounce silver one, this is always my go-to. But lots of good 1/4 ounce ones. So these are Strike King. They have a little bit of fatter nose, kind of gives them more of a wobble in the water, heavier front wobble than the Bill Lewis rattle traps do. So here's a 1/2 ounce versus a 1/4 ounce. So this is just a regular Bill Lewis rattle trap, and then this is a Strike King. So this one really tapers off in the back, kind of rounds off, so it gives it a really good front end wobble, where this is kind of more of just a tapered but same consistency. So it keeps a really tight wobble on it the whole way. But this is what a 1/4 ounce is going to look like. It's going to be just a little bit, just a shade smaller than your 1/2 ounce, but shad colors out in the big water. This is a good thread fin pattern. If you're in a pond or a small body of water, shiner, something in gold. But lots of different brands are going to make, some type of a lipless crankbait. But as long as you're sticking, when you're out on the bigger water, either a bluegill pattern or purple, something that's got some purple in it, or just a straight gold or silver. And then your reds. Your reds are all, especially in some of the muddier water, if you're not going to go with a chartreuse or a white, going with something that maybe has a little bit of yellow, you're going to get some of that bluegill in that bottom, and then you're going to get your crawfish. You're going to get just lots of good with some bright red. These ones have all been sitting on each other, but here's a really good one. Just the original red craw. This is always killer in Oklahoma and Texas. So you're looking for bass, this is a hard one to beat. 1/4 ounce, great bait. So let's see if we have any more. I have some cream pond ones. So in that bass guide that's over in the link, and if you received the email earlier this week, one of my top lipless baits in that one was these cream pond favorites. How you got wrapped in there? There we go. And they make two different colors. They make a nice little golden shiner. So this is going to be a 16th ounce. So unlike the tiny traps that we get from Bill Lewis that go down to an 1/8 of an ounce, in order to get a 16th of an ounce to fish some smaller water like your ponds, these are going to be great. So they're the same size profile as that 1/8 ounce rattle trap, but these are a little bit lighter. So they come in a 16th ounce. So these are perfect. I like the gold ones in ponds. Especially I live in central Oklahoma. So most of the ponds that I fish, I always seem to find golden shiners. So a nice gold color is always really productive for me. And then they also make kind of a blue back. You get a little bit of lots of different kind of colorations in through that silver. So that's a really good one for out on the lake. And then there's other brands that I found over the years. I'm not quite sure what brand this is, but I've always found these at Walmart over the years. And they kind of come in you get some different kind of shad patterns. This one is a rattle trap. I'm not quite sure which this one is, but lipless crankbaits, just something that's giving you a lot of just bait fish patterns in there. So those are going to be productive lipless crankbaits for you. Blade baits, we suggest using blade baits like the ones you get at Bass Pro that actually look like small fish. Yeah, blades are going to accomplish the same thing as a rattle trap or a lipless crankbait. The thing with most lipless crankbaits, because it is a full body bait as opposed to a blade, you're getting rattle within it. So all these baits are attempting to accomplish the same thing, just through different means. So with a diving bait, we're able to get a little bit different movement, and we can put things inside of them to create additional attractants. So balls, rattles, flashes, anything that you can put in that. A blade is just giving off a very subtle wobble. So on heavily pressured water that might see a lot of crankbaits, a lot of just that noise that's in the water, a blade might be a way to get you into a few more fish because it's more of a subtle presentation. Fish like largemouth bass, especially in water that's a little bit dingier, they rely heavily on their lateral line to sense where prey is at. And if it's a lot of knocking and bouncing and all that, and those fish are just constantly getting that on bodies of water that are heavily pressured, a blade is kind of the way to go, or a soft plastic swim bait where you're getting a lot less disruption in the water, but you're accomplishing the same thing. It's a bait fish. It's just all these different kind of molds and models of them are just attempting to mimic a bait fish while adding additional stimulants to it. So yeah, blades are great. The problem with blades is that it's oftentimes hard to find them in a light enough class. Blades are typically kind of in that 1/2 ounce up to an ounce. A lot of people use them to vertically jig, especially you can vertically jig for largemouth offshore. But a lot of people use blades in Oklahoma to vertically jig for hybrid striped bass. That's pretty popular in lakes that have a good size class of hybrids in that 2 to 8 pound range. When they get into big schools and 20-25 feet of water, vertically dropping down a blade and erratically jigging up that blade and letting it fall back down. But you'll catch largemouth bass on them. It's just hard to find them in that small enough size profile. So if you are using them in some deeper water, you might end up finding yourself a bigger fish. So here is a box full of what are typically marketed as panfish crankbaits, but these are dynamite for your small bass because obviously it can fit in their mouth, but you get lots of good shallow diving. You can swim these a lot faster because they're really light. Now this one right here is the deepest diving of them. You could probably get this down to maybe 6 feet, maybe 8 if you were really cranking it, but it's not going to move through the water overly fast. So this is about as big of a bill as I would be looking for, if you're on a body of water, maybe around a dam where you want to drive it down to like 6-8 feet. This would be a good one, but these are real small. I mean, we're talking barely over an inch, if an inch profile. Every brand is going to have some type of small bill bait. How they market it, is up to them. Most of the time, though, they're advertised as on the packaging. It says something like panfish or crappie or bluegill. Very rarely do they actually label them as bass, but these are great for bass, especially little ones like this. You can fish these really shallow because most of your build baits, if not all of them, especially square bills and rounded bill hard body baits like this, your little short and fat ones, these are almost always floating. So when you cast these out, they land on the water. The bill is what takes it underwater. So these are super light. They have just a couple of rattle balls that are in them. So they make just a very subtle knock. They're not nearly as loud as your bigger build crankbaits, but something just a brown, red, gold. Here's a good one for golden shiners. Again, when I fish ponds, I really love something that if I'm not going straight like purple, and I'll show a couple of those in a minute, but having that dark back with that gold flash through it, because you also get a lot of bluegill in that. Just depending on the water turbidity, a lot of your bluegill, you're going to have that iridescent, but a lot of times it's really just kind of that yellow that's through it. So having a gold, but these are two dynamite colors. Doesn't matter if you're fishing a pond or a lake, you're going to find success with baits like these. And these are a really good size profile for your bass. Here is a sinking non-lipped bait, but again, it's in that real panfish size. This is a real good one. You can kind of work it like a jerk bait and just pop it, or again, all these baits, steady retrieve, just cast it out. I mean, it's about as easy as it gets when it comes to fishing, when you can just cast straight out with an artificial and just start cranking in. You're not pausing, popping, doing anything with the rod. It's great for everybody. It's a good thing, if you're a longtime bass angler or you're doing it for the very first time, you're taking somebody new, any types of these, build or lipless crankbaits are very just straightforward. Cast them out, reel them straight in. And so when you stick with these smaller sizes, something in the, that if they're floating bait, 1 to 3 foot diver, that way you can cast them right at the bank. If you happen to hit the bank or something like that, you're not going to drag them down super quick right into problems. So these do a really nice job in that shallower water, work great in ponds, but in the backs of coves, wind-driven points where you can see bass coming up and busting right along the bank where they're chasing fish in. You can get those into those areas with a hard bait without getting it hung up. So things in this size profile. You can also get like a minnow flasher. So this is weighted, so this will sink, but again, very small bait profile, and it's not very heavy. I think this is a 1/16 of an ounce. If it is anything more than that, it's barely an 1/8 of an ounce. So this is great. Flip that up into shallow water. Then you also get the added, flasher with it. So instead of just having a little bit of rattle inside of it, like you do with all these other build baits, you're also getting a little extra enticement with the flash. So, but it's what you're looking for with your build and hard baits, non-build baits. These can be good. Had success with these a lot out at Arcadia, back in coves and things like that for like white bass and smaller bass. And every now and then you ding a good one, but long, slender ones, and very, you can throw these right up on the bank and you're just going to get really good movement through those. And color schemes like this, your purple with your dark back, maybe something that's got more of that kind of bluegill flash in it, but could also, mimic a shad or something. Just those iridescent type colors, those are going to be really good. So that's what you're looking for in that. If you're in super cloudy water, stained water, you might elect for something that maybe has more of that chartreuse in it and white. But maybe more. Spin caster or bait caster, what size test line do you suggest for these smaller lures? It really just depends on your skill level. Any type of equipment can be utilized to throw these types of baits. What you're gonna be most comfortable with throwing, especially those smaller ones. Now, the lipless crankbaits that I showed, those are heavy enough, even the 16th ounce, you can throw those on a medium action rod, maybe even a medium heavy action rod, and not have a whole lot of line lash if you're using 10-pound and under. Now, if you get into the last box that I showed, those are very small, and you probably want to fine tune those with like, you know, a light action rod or a medium light action rod. 6-pound test probably at the most. You know, 6-pound test is a really good kind of overall line. That's 6 to 8 pound. But with those smaller ones, you know, if it was me, when I throw those on a spinning outfit. So I'll throw them on a 6 foot to 6'6" medium light to light action rod, 6-pound test, fluorocarbon, throw them out. But fluoro, mono, braided line, you know, 6-pound test is going to be good for those really small baits. You can throw them on 4-pound test. The only problem is that if you're fishing like a body of water you're really familiar with, so let's say you're fishing your pond or your neighborhood pond or a pond you fish all the time, small lake, you kind of know the size structure of fish that you're going to get yourself into. So you want to downsize to 4-pound test and a 5'6" rod. You're going to be just fine. It's going to give you a nice little fun pull with a 10-inch bass, or you're going to get even more of a pull from like a 6-inch sunfish than you will from like a 10, 11, 12-inch bass. But if you're out at the big water or a big lake that you're unfamiliar with, you throw baits like those, you can still get big fish, whether it's a largemouth, whether it's a saw guy, happen to hit into a big white bass or a hybrid striped bass. So you get into that 4-pound line class, light action rod, then it just becomes, what your skill level is at this point in time with hooking up fish. But it's going to hard to go wrong with the spinning outfit or a spin casting outfit, 10-pound test and under. But with those really, really small ones, you're going to struggle to throw them with a heavy action rod or a medium action rod that's got line that's 8 pounds plus. It's just, you can throw them, you're just not going to be able to maximize your distance with them. They'll fish the same, and you'll definitely be able to hold on to anything. But if you really want to zing it out to maximum line, looking at a spinning outfit that's got a soft tip, something like a medium light action rod that's got a really, those top 2 eye guides are really flexible and the rest of the rod is fairly stiff, where it gives you just enough when you get it back to let it go that it's going to give you maximum line extension. And then it's going to be super sensitive as you're bringing it in. But the great thing about lipped and lipless baits, hard baits in general, they get pounded. It's not a subtle bite. It's not fishing finesse with soft plastics where, the type of rod you're using can have subtle differences on your ability to sense a bite or not. When you're just straight, steady retrieving, that's the easiest way to fish because you never miss the bite. I mean, it stops it in its track. So that's that would be my recommendation, is sticking with, a medium to medium light action rod with 6-pound test at the most, down to 4-pound test, especially if it's body of water. You're pretty familiar with the species that are in it and the size class that you're going to get into. So the next build baits that we have, let's see here. So we have just a bunch of square bills. I like square bills for bass fishing, for largemouth fishing, because I'm not trying to get overly deep when I'm fishing with them. Typically, when I'm using hard baits, I am in fairly shallow water. I'm not as comfortable fishing deep water with deep diving crankbaits. That's something that I'm not overly familiar with. I don't do it a lot, so that's not my comfort zone. I like throwing 1 to 5 foot divers along shoreline, points, coves, ponds, things like that. So I typically stick with the square bill, something that's going to dive 1 to 5 feet. If you're out, here's a box of just some pretty basic shad colors with a few kind of bluegill patterns mixed in. So lots of whites, different types of shad patterns. This ghost color, this is what you're going to look for if you're in super stained water. Let's say it's October, water's perfect, temps are perfect, get a big rain come through, you're fishing a lake like Thunderbird or Arcadia, western lakes that may cloud up real good, any of our prairie lakes that can get really muddy. that's going to be real good. That's going to do a great job of mimicking that, as a shad, they lose that color. Any other type of just regular water. So if the water's in its typical shape, maybe you throw a throw net. Maybe maybe you catfish the lake. Maybe you're really familiar with the shad species or the shad color on that body of water. Here's two shad patterns. The only difference between these two is just the shade of their back. So again, there's some bodies of water, if it's clear enough, that might make a difference, depending on what those shad actually look like. Most cases, probably not going to matter that much. You're just looking for something that's going to be in that basic shad color. The ones like these that have a little bit more flash to them, that's something that I use usually more when I'm chasing temperate bass species around. If I'm going for largemouth, I'm either in just a straight chartreuse and dark, something like that, if I'm not in a shad, or I'm just going, some type of bluegill imitation, which is going to be, purple backs, little iridescent through them, yellow or gray bodies. These are going to be a really good color for largemouth bass. These again are shallow divers, so you're just putting these in the backs of coves, and in the backs of coves, whether or not bass are keyed in on having maybe some shad that they've trapped back there, and that's what they're targeting. In those types of areas, you're also going to have bluegill present. It's not one of those things where you get into the back of a cove, there might not be any shad present, but you're always going to have sunfish. So typically when if I'm targeting largemouth bass, I'm going to usually favor more of a bluegill pattern than I am a shad pattern. Shad patterns, I run into more multi-species more often than not. But if you know for a fact that you can see it, you have bass that have shad trapped, then yeah, obviously you're trying to match the hatch with that. But really hard to go wrong with just using a bluegill imitation of some kind in a crankbait. It's always going to pay dividends for you. My favorite bait for that is this right here. So that's my go-to if I'm ever using a build crankbait. That type of color right there. You get the good vertical banding on it. It's very lifelike, especially if you have vibrant sunfish. This might not be as effective in a lake like Thunderbird that's always cloudy. Those fish are going to be a little bit paler, but most places that's going to be just spot on of your eater size bluegill. So this is always my go-to, but technology's come a long ways. The way that they can print on these hard baits, so you get ones that are super lifelike. I think that one is lifelike just from the colors that it's putting off, but the way that they can print on them now, if you're over in eastern Oklahoma, you get a lot of long ear. That's basically just a 3D print of a long ear, and then you get something like that. So they're getting pretty good with these lifelike printing now, but hard to beat just some gold and some gold color with some purple. Always going to find you some success. So. But here's some more something like that. That's what I stick to. I mean, if I'm out on the lake, especially a big reservoir, that if I'm familiar with it or not familiar with it, if I'm going with a build bait, it's always, I'm going to switch between, I'm going to have these rigged up on 2 different rods, and that's what I'm going to be throwing for my build baits until I find one of them having more success. If I'm having to switch around too often, then I'm probably not going to be able to figure it out anyways. So I'll just go to a different type of fishing, or, not throwing a build bait. Then you can never beat white. I mean, as far as just, if you want just something basic that you can throw in every lake in Oklahoma and never switch it up, you want a crankbait, something that's got some shad dots on it that's just white. You're going to find fish with that. So those and that particular type of, just having a basic white, you're always going to be able to find that from a brand. So it doesn't, you can be at a local mom and pop bait shop, Walmart, Academy, any big retailer, you're always going to be able to find a square bill white shad crankbait. So can't really go wrong with that. You're not gonna run yourself into any problems if you're just looking to catch largemouth bass, throwing something like that. So that is the end of our bill bait. So now we're gonna run into what one of my favorite baits is for hard baits to use, especially at this time of year. This isn't necessarily ideal for catching small largemouth. You will catch some, but you are more than likely to run into some lunkers at this time of year fishing jerk baits. I'm partial to the Rapala rip stops. I really like this bait, and that's just because I'm really comfortable fishing it. They make lots and lots of different brands, or different brands make different versions of a jerk bait, but this is a good one in ponds that don't have a lot of vegetative cover, which they typically start to run out of it this time of year, but there's always residual down on the bottom. So when you're fishing a pond that typically has a lot of vegetative growth in it, even if you don't see it on the top anymore, odds are that even though it's, either dying off for the winter or it's going dormant, more than likely there's still going to be, pretty good growth down towards the bottom, even if it just isn't as active it is in the summer. But if you have ponds or small lakes that don't have a lot of vegetative growth, they have more hardwoods and rock, then it's real. Like, I would go to a jerk bait before I would a bill bait, just because I like the bite. But purple, gold, those are my two go-to colors. They make these things in every single color pattern that you can imagine. So jerk baits are a good one at this time of year, just because they start to key in on those bait fish, and it does a really good job of just a fleeting bait fish. Those bites come typically during the pause. So you pop it. You can do that with the rod tip. You can do it with the reel handle, however you like to fish and are comfortable with. Just giving them a quick crank or a pop of the rod, and then when it pauses, they usually get nailed right in that brief pause. And you can bang them into things. You can run them over rocks. I just like them because you just get a lot of action out of them, working the bait in. Whereas if that's not your cup of tea, if you really want something a little bit more simplistic as far as the retrieve, then a build bait or a lipless crankbait is going to be, better suited for you, because it's just going to give you just a constant motion. You're not having to do as many things. And if you're not familiar with fishing a jerk bait, the first time that you do use one, odds are you're probably going to give yourself a couple of line lashes from either having too much slack from popping the rod. It just takes a little bit of practice to get the hang of kind of the cadence. Same with like a walk the dog lure. Same deal. You eventually get that rhythm and that cadence down, and then it becomes second nature. But until you do, if you want to just get out there, it's pretty easy to just get yourself a build or a lipless crankbait to straight retrieve. But these are Yozuri crankbaits. Just a little bit different body profile than those rip stops, and then like the original Rapala minnow that everybody even people who haven't fished, have probably seen that lure profile somewhere. But this gives you a lot of good color in it. You get that orange kind of belly, so you're going to get some bluegill out of this. You're also getting that side flash, so you're getting shad. This is a pretty good color scheme because you're getting just a lot of different types of prey species. I'm a very big advocate of never throwing a bait or a artificial lure that is so specific to one thing. If you can get multiple value out of the same lure, that's always going to get you hooked up more often. You're going to find more success catching fish. And then here's a gold one. So again, you can get some bluegill out of this, depending on how much sunlight is getting to that flash. You get that dark back, a little bit of that orange belly, but great if you got golden shiners. So pretty common theme for me. Lots of purples, lots of bluegill, lots of golden shiners. And then we have just the original Rapala floating and sinking minnows that come in a few different sizes. So here's kind of the 3 common sizes that they have. So here's our largest version. Here is our medium version. And here is our small version. So with your bass, those smaller ones, you're probably going to want to stick to the smallest one or this maybe medium-sized one. But this is a good one. And this is a floating one. They make these both floating and sinking. I think they even make them suspending now as well. But you can straight retrieve these in like a build bait and they'll wobble, or you can also use them as a jerk bait. So one of the original good hard baits that got a lot of popularity and still, to this day is made the same way and just as effective. So that brings us through all of our hard baits. A few more questions. Can we use? Yeah, I believe this year it had the way that it's worded in there of using crappie. Now you've been able to use crappie in the I think it was in the past. You had to have the fish off the water. Like, so if you had the entrails or the guts to put on trot lines after you were done fishing. The big thing with all those rules about using game fish or just having fillets on you when you're actively engaged in fishing is once you've cut the fish up, it's impossible really to determine what species it is. So then it's hard from a law enforcement perspective to be able to, determine whether or not you're over limit or not. But I do believe they did ease that restriction this year to make it a little bit more understandable for people, because most people go use the crappie guts. They'll go crappie fishing and then they use the entrails after they've cleaned the fish, the heads, the tails maybe, to catfish. One other, I guess these aren't really hard baits. It's kind of a combo, but umbrella rigs. They come in something that looks like this. This is one of the main ones that you're going to see in retailers is going to be this Flash Mob Junior. It's a good size one. These ones will come now where they actually have the soft plastics with them. So they sell the jig heads. This one package kind of got busted open, but you get your umbrella rig, you get the jig heads for the swim baits, and you can attach them. So if you've never used an umbrella rig before and want to try it for the first time, I recommend getting something like this because it's all packaged together. Once you get comfortable with it, you can make your own. There's specialty ones that are sold, and you can tinker with weights and jig heads and all that stuff. But good time of year to use something like that. The only thing is you're throwing that big bait ball out there. Again, these types of baits were really designed to catch bigger fish. Not to say they won't catch smaller ones, but if you're really going after those under 16-inch fish, looking for small profile baits, fishing shallower sheltered water in coves, smaller bodies of water, wind-driven sides, keeping it near structure, that's where you're going to find those types of fish. So that moves us into our softer baits, which again, at this time of year, you're still going to find fish, especially, in where there's still vegetative cover. You're always going to be able to catch largemouth bass on soft plastics year round. I just happen to think that the fall is kind of that one time a year where you can really get into the hard baits, spinner baits, things that are just straight, steady retrieves that are mimicking bait fish. And for most anglers, that's going to be your easiest type of fishing. You're power fishing. So you're fan casting, you're making a ton of casts real quick. You get a lot of bang for your buck that day of fishing. When you fish soft plastics, you slow down a lot. You maybe don't make as many casts. Lots of other variables are in play, like how much is the wind blowing versus how much weight I have. So my line's getting bowed. All those different variables that can play into having successful bites. Now, the smaller the body of water, the easier it gets. So if you're on a pond, stick worms, little soft plastic swim baits, jigs. Typically with the jigs, they don't really make them small enough. Now, This is a Z-Man Ned head jig that's got the skirt on it. This is the right size. Something like this, and you can hop this along the bottom. You can put a small like tube or a little swim bait, little tiny craw. This is a really good size profile. Most jigs and bladed jigs that you're going to find that are sold, even the 1/8 ounce ones, are still going to be a pretty big profile. Um, Something like this. And it's really not so much the actual profile of the skirt and the jig head itself, it's the hooks. So we're dealing where that's why I like these little Ned head ones. This is essentially the size of like your standard crappie jig head hook, real small hook shank and point. That is more like a 3/4 offset bass hook on a jig. So when you get into those your jigs, you're still going to catch bass, especially one of the staples of bass fishing is a pig and jig, or all the different types of soft plastic trailers that they make these days. When you get into your soft plastics and your skirts, most of the time black and blue, green pumpkin, somewhere in those types of shades. Those are always going to give you the most amount of success. You can use a chartreuse or an orange or a red and get reactionary bites and things like that. And they may be prevalent on a certain body of water in the state. But all around, black and blue, green pumpkin. But for catching those smaller bass, jigs, just from that hook point, you're going to get a lot of short strikes, especially if they're hitting the soft plastic trailer, they're hitting the skirt. Just when we're trying to catch the fish that have mouths that are more like this as opposed to like this, there's just way more, variables that can happen when they go to get that bite, that you're not getting that hook point in the mouth, even though you're getting bit. So all of these Asking Anglers are really just trying to give, we want you to be successful. We want you to catch the most amount of fish, maximize your time. Not everybody has the opportunity to be out on the water 100 days a year. So you may only get to go a couple weekends or a day here or there. You want to be out there trying to catch as many fish as possible. And when we're targeting this particular type of fish and this size class of fish, the best route to get there is going to be smaller hooks, smaller profile baits, and treble hooks on your hard baits. Big singular hooks, 1/0 to 5/0 offset worm hooks, when you're going out there to catch those 2, 3, 4, 5 pound bass, those are great. But when you're looking to try to actively catch those 6, 8, 10, 12-inch fish, you'll get bit all day long. They'll grab the tail, they'll take swipes at it, but your hookup success is going to be much less than it is when you're getting into some of those bigger bass. What rod reel combo setup would you recommend on a budget? I'm partial to spinning equipment. That's just what I grew up using. So when it comes to spin casters or bait casters or spinning equipment, I'm always partial to spinning equipment. But the best budget for your, or the best value for your budget is either going and buying some type of Shakespeare combo. If you buy really cheap equipment, you get what you pay for. You might get a few good days of use out of it. You're probably going to break the reel. They're just, that's what you're paying for the most part when you're buying a combo, is you're paying for the reel. It's kind of like when you buy a boat, you're really paying for the motor. You're not paying really so much for the boat. Shakespeare combos are good. You can get good combos in between like anywhere from like $35 to $75. I mean, that's what I recommend, because you're getting more kind of a middle class. It's not super expensive and it's also not super cheap. You can usually take care of that equipment and get the best bang for your buck. But, it's hard to beat like a Zebco 33 spin caster. Those are going to run you probably $49. I don't know with inflation right now, what they're marked up at different stores, but just a big retailer, a Walmart, a Bass Pro Academy, you're probably going to, getting a spin casting setup is going to be a medium action rod. It's probably going to come spooled with 8 to 10 pound test. That's going to be a really reliable rod for you. Is if you like a spin casting setup. Most of your bait casting combos these days are going to be on kind of the pricier range, even for the least expensive. You're starting to look at that 79, 89, 99, 120 class. But with spinning equipment and spin casting equipment, the spin casting equipment, you're going to probably get yourself the best value and the most use out of a rod like that. So somewhere it's going to be between like 49 and 79 bucks. And you're going to be right there the same if you wanted a spinning outfit of a lose combo or a Shakespeare combo or an ugly stick combo, something like that. That's what I'd be looking for. Somewhere in that 49 to 79 range for just a good, going to last you quite a while. You're going to get pretty good value out of something like that in a spinning or a spin casting setup. So, let's see. I mean, most of the soft plastics that I have are, again, they're very commonplace in bass fishing. But for the success that you're going to get into trying to target some of these fish at this time of year, you really want to try to stick towards bait fish imitators. Most of your soft plastics, whether it be a worm, a brush hog, how we rig these is, even if you're using a jig head, and this is what I try to stress, for the difference between getting bit and landing fish is really just what type of hook are you using and where is that hook in relation to your bait. So if I was to use a 1/0 to 5/0 offset worm hook, something that looks like this, just some of them are just regular offset. This is going to be like an extra wide gap hook. Those are going to be labeled as like EWG. But anything that's just an offset worm hook, I'm still middle bait by the time that hook point comes through. So whether I want to fish this weedless and weightless, or I want to put a bullet weight on it and fish it Texas rigged, or I want to Carolina rig it, want to drop shot it, it doesn't matter. My hook point is still going to be middle of the bait. So that means that when that bass comes up, or that sunfish or whatever, and they go and grab that bait, there's half the bait that they can grab without ever getting over that hook point. So when you're sticking to soft plastics at this time of year, I will briefly go through the different soft plastics that are available for bass fishing, because we're talking about catching fish under 16 inches, not under 10 inches. These are going to catch you 14 and 15 and 16 inch fish. That's not going to be a problem. But those 8 to 12 inchers, which is what I personally would prefer to eat and cook, that's going to be your most abundant size range. So if you own your own pond, you own your own lake, you fish the same small body of water all the time, and you really want to see an improvement with your size class to be able to catch those bigger fish when we get into the winter and the spring, which is when most people are targeting specifically big fish, because that's the time of the year that gives you the best opportunity to catch a big fish. In order to create that environment where we're harvesting in the fall, catching big fish in the spring, and then maybe you're mixing it up in the summer. You're catching panfish or you're catfishing. Maybe you throw in some bass fishing here and there, but it's not top of mind dog days of summer. So to really maximize largemouth bass fishing, you really have the fall and you have that winter spring period. And this is the best time of year to get those smaller fish and catch them in a way that's pretty easy, because you can throw bait fish imitators. But I'll rig these both ways with a jig head and with an offset hook. And this is going to be the same for every soft plastic that I show that before we get to the small ones. So if you want to rig up your soft plastic, and especially if you're fishing heavy cover, odds are you probably want to bury that hook. So you want to fish it weedless. So in order to do that, we go right in through the nose of the bait, right on the top. And you bring that hook point down, and everybody does this a little bit differently. So you have your eyelid up here. And I typically like to cover my eyelid with my soft plastic. So you tie your hook on to your line first. So you just have your hook on there. Now, if you're going to Texas rig it, then you also want to make sure that you put, your bullet weight on your line first, and then tie your hook on. So it'll be looking like this. And then you'll go to put your soft plastic on. Good rule of thumb with these to get it in the perfect spot is just to go down the hook point until you hit the turn. Then once you hit the turn on a brush hog like this, you want to be coming out on the side where all the appendages are perpendicular. So you want to be coming out the fat side. You don't want your hook point coming out on the side where those appendages are. So you pop it right out. It's going to look like that. Then you're going to work that up the hook shank, and it'll slide right up the hook shank, and then it's going to turn so that where your hook point came out is now going down the shank. And that will slide up, and that'll cover and completely conceal our eyelid, and then that leaves that. You want to be able to just bend your soft plastic so you give it just a little bit of give. You don't want to go on too high because then it's going to stretch it. You're going to rip your bait up. So you want to just kind of make him look like he's sitting in a chair. And then you're going to poke that hook point all the way through the soft plastic, all the way through. And then it'll slide down like that. And then to make it weedless, all you got to do is just pull that soft plastic a little bit forward in front of that hook point and then let it fall backwards. Now we're weedless and weightless. Now when our fish comes, we can pull this through all types of different junk and not get snagged and hung up with that hook point. And then when the fish comes and it hits it, it knocks it down, that hook point's exposed, you set the hook. You can do the same thing with the jig head, where you can bring it out and do the same exact thing and turn it and put it on. But most of the time, what people will do with the jig head is you're just going full body. So you're going to work that all the way up the shank. And this takes a little bit of practice to know where you want it to come through. Some people will hold the soft plastic up at the collar and let it hang down and pinch it right there so they know where they're going to poke the hook point through. If you've been doing it long enough, it just kind of becomes, you can just eyeball it. But again, we're not looking to have too much hanging on there, and we don't want too much hanging off. We want it to just kind of be flush down that hook point. So that one's got just a little bit much, but not too bad. So I wouldn't adjust this one. I would leave that. That's fine the way that it is. And that's it. And you do that with all your soft plastics. You're gonna do that with, you're gonna do that with curly tail worms. You're gonna do that with straight stick worms. You're gonna do that with trick worms. You're gonna do that with any type of creature bait, whether it's a crawfish, mud bug, whatever the packaging is called. And you're probably looking at a 4 to 5 inch soft plastic. That's what most of these baits are going to be. Your smaller profile soft plastics that have appendages are typically, they weren't intended to be put on like a hook like this or even on a jig head. They were really meant to be a trailer for a jig or for a bladed jig or for a blade or a buzz bait or a spinner bait, something like that. They were meant to be trailers. You can use them and put them on a jig head like this, and that works great. But typically, if you're looking to size down with the soft plastic for largemouth bass to catch those smaller fish, it's really hard to beat a tube or a grub. Those are really designed better for catching the smaller fish because that hook point is much closer to the back of the bait. Let's see, we had some more questions pop up. Do you ever rig those on the side? I've seen some people do that. I mean, largemouth bass, we're talking about appendages that are flailing through there. You could come up through the side just on something like the brush hog where I'd have to come out of the side. I'd be going through the little arm. So it kind of gets messy on how you put it on there. But again, most of all these soft plastics are same as a hard baits. They're really just trying to mimic bait fish or prey of some kind that, you're just getting reactionary out of the fish. So all the appendages are just more stimulation of things that fish and frogs and lizards and insects and crayfish. All of these baits are essentially just trying to take the best stimulation qualities of those prey sources and package them into a artificial lure that an angler can then use to get the fish to respond in the same way that it would to natural prey. So for specific fisheries, so I'm going to run through these soft plastics really quick. We've got about half an hour left. And then we'll move on to actually talking about the public fishing destinations, the best places, public access to go to catch these size fish. So that was our brush hog box. Here's a lizard box. You'd rig these the same exact way. Again, we're looking at profiles that are pretty big. They do make some lizards that are more in that 3-inch. This one, but it's still just a little bit longer than my finger. But on like a 1 to 5/0 hook, you could get that hook back here to the end of the tail, to the base. So that means you're only going to have about that much behind you, 1.5 to 2 inches if it's stretched out. So that's not terrible. But again, we're trying to get that hook point real close to the back of the bait. So got stick worms, same deal. Now stick worms we'll break these down a little bit more because you can buy much smaller stick worms than you can most of like the creature and other appendage type baits. But stick worms, I really like red and black, June bug. Those are kind of my go-to, but it's hard to argue against, a green pumpkin or a watermelon. All the baits for bass are pretty similar as far as colors go. Here's some trick worms. Purples, I like this for our bluegill. We get that iridescent flash through it. But then we also have something like this that also gives off a nice, good bluegill kind of flash through it. You can rig these all the same exact way, and they're all about the same exact size profile. Here's another box of just some basic stick worms. I think everything else is pretty much the same. Here's more of our creature, our different types of crawfish. So you can get a little bit closer to the backs of these. So if I was going to recommend any appendage bait to use at this time of year to catch some smaller sized fish, it would be your crawfish patterns or your crawfish different types. So all these are going to be different brands, different makes and models, but they're all essentially mimicking crayfish. But they can also double as frogs or, even fish. But you can get these are all good size profiles. They're all going to be right around your finger. So you can get your hook point real close to the backs of these. And because they have the pincers or some type of bulb on the end and it's not a curly tail, your hook point is always going to be really close to where these are. You always rig them through that. Don't ever rig them on the pincer side. So your hook point should be coming out down here right towards where the face of the bait is. And that's why they leave that little knob on you. But green pumpkins, watermelons, blacks, blues, reds. That's what you're looking for colors on that. So that would be my one recommendation of a bigger size soft plastic for this time of year. Maybe even a frog. If I don't fish really soft plastic frog baits, especially subsurface, because I'll use a tube, and a tube is accomplishing the same thing. But you'll get things that that look like this, and again, you can get this is pretty big, but all options that you got. I mean, they make so many soft plastics now that make your brain spin if you go into a Bass Pro or an Academy or something that's got a real big retail section. You have your swim baits as options. Again, like a fluke or like a magic shad, a jointed swim bait. They're great for bass fishing. Dynamite for bass fishing. But when it comes to catching these smaller fish, where we get those 4, 5, 6 inch bait profiles, it's hard to find baits that are in that 3 and under on the soft plastics to mimic the same way that you do with those bigger baits. This is a good one. This one's only going to be the size of the finger. So this one, you can put a jig head through the top of it. You're going to get your hook point right there where that fat body meets the tail. that's going to be about as good as it gets. That's 1 inch behind. You can get a lot of value out of a paddle tail, boot tail, whatever you want to call it, swim bait. Or you can do something like a caffeine shad. If you can get this small enough, I don't know if they make a smaller size in this one or not, or just a basic, a fluke. Now they do make like junior flukes that are going to be more like 3 inches. This is a super fluke, so this is a little over 5 inches. But whites, chartreuses, green pumpkin, they make something in a bluegill color. Rig those the same exact way as you did as I showed with the brush hog, either with a jig head or with a offset hook. Some swim baits like these have open body cavities on them, so you can actually fish them with a weighted bait or a weighted hook shank, which looks something like this. So we still have our same offset hook, but instead of going through the nose of them, because you'd have to work that through the nose, you're going to damage the bait. They have an open body cavity on them like that. You just take the eye guide and you go up into the body, and then you just force that right through the soft plastic so that you don't damage anything. And that comes out right there. The weight is hidden inside the cavity, and then you would take that hook point, go right into that open cavity, and then pop it straight through the back. And then you can either leave it exposed completely, because if you're fishing this out in open water, there's no threat of a hang up. But if you're trying to fish that closer into like structure or something, you do the same thing. You pull that soft plastic forward, let that hook point fall into it, and it's going to look just like that. Ribbed, things that have ribs on them. So here's a couple of different brands, Zoom and Guggen baits, both around that kind of 3 inch size. Do the same thing with these as well. Texas rig them, put a jig head in them. You can get your hook point back pretty close to where you're tapering off on the tail. But swim baits for sure at this time of year, if I'm going soft plastics, but they also make pre-molded soft plastics. So like Storm Eye shad, you get a lot of value out of something like that because they're pre-made swim baits. So you don't have to physically rig them. They're a little bit more expensive and you can ruin them. The guts can get knocked out of them and things like that. But that's what you're looking for with the soft plastic. Because again, this time of year, it's all about bait fish. It's all about bluegill. Classic curly tail worms, pretty standard. But again, these are going to be 5-6 inches long, maybe 4 inches. I don't know if you can get a true worm that's like a 3 inch, but hook point, you got to get it close to the back. So I would look for something that is more like this type of soft plastic, more of a boot tail that is real small. So these are what you're looking for. Again, for all of our bass, our little bass that we're trying to catch, look in the panfish section. Go to the crappie section at your local retailer, your bait shop, and look for stuff that's like this. Because these you're going to be able to toss up into, shallow cover. But again, we're coming out of the summer, so a lot of species that spawn, especially our smaller bait fish, they spawn later than those bass. So they're spawning May into June, and their fry are going to be starting to come into sizes that are about this. So not only you can catch big fish on these because they're keying in on the same thing, but you're going to catch those you're going to target those bass that we're trying to target with things like this, because this is a perfect size class. And you can get these in like 16th ounce, 32nd ounce, things that you can really throw shallow and keep them from getting snagged. So when you're sticking to your soft plastic baits at this time of year to target those bass, you really ought to be looking probably in like the crappie section for little swim baits. You can also use like sassy shad, things that you might use for white bass. Rooster tails. Rooster tails are great. I love rooster tails because the hook point is in the very back of the bait. But nice and small, white, chartreuse, black, basic. Here's your shad. Here's something for a little bit maybe dingier water that you get a nice flash out of. But these are all real small. These are all, I think these are like 1 7/8 is what they're packaged as, maybe 2 inches. Just depends on the brand, the make and model of them. But pairing those with just a basic crappie jig, a 16th ounce ball jig head. If you're in a little bit deeper water, like maybe along a dam where it drops off real quick, but those fish are pushed up and you have those small bait fish, you might up it to like an 1/8 ounce jig head and just run them right through the back. And that's gonna be dynamite at this time of year. Also small grubs, hard to go wrong with grubs. So curly tail grubs, whites, chartreuses. This tail right here, we're halfway of the hook, but it's a small enough bait profile overall that a bass can inhale all of that. So we're not worried about him grabbing the back of it so much. This one, we're a little bit closer to the back. If you're not going to go with a white or chartreuse, which is just, always great colors, you can go to something more natural, like a green pumpkin or a brown, something that maybe has black or red flake on it. You can go with a basic ball head jig or a road runner. Give yourself some extra flash. White heads, red heads, chartreuse heads, doesn't really matter. Baby shad, again, like crappie gear, something like this, just like a little Bobby Garland or a little, Strike King or Bass Pro, just whatever makes a little baby crab or a baby shad, Mr. Crappie, anything like that. Some of them have the little bumper tails on the back of them to give them a little bit extra. This is a good bluegill one, but just whites and silvers are going to be fine. Anytime that you rig something like that or one of these like sassy shad type baits, you go in through the nose of the bait with that jig head and you work it all the way up the shank, but make sure that you're coming out on the flat side, not on the fat side. Biggest thing is, which way is your tail going? You want to make sure that tail, when you do any type of swim bait that's got a boot on it, that boot is facing down. That boot's facing up, it doesn't work through the water quite as well. Not how it was designed to swim. All right, I think that kind of brings us to like what my favorite baits are for largemouth, especially this time of year, and especially on smaller bodies of water, which is always going to be my go-to tubes. Little Squirm and Squirt Bass Pro. I like 1.5, 2-inch ones for largemouth. That hook point's real close. This is just such a good versatile bait throughout the course of the year. Can be a frog, can be a small bluegill, small bait fish. You just get so much value out of a tube for largemouth bass and smallmouth bass. And then your panfish species, your crappie, and your sunfish. Something like this. If you're looking for a small, soft plastic, again, you're going to find all of these things in the crappie section, like at Bass Pro. If you're in something that maybe doesn't break it up by species, panfish, you're just going to find these in like the small sections. But pairing them with the 16th ounce, 32nd ounce, maybe an 1/8 ounce, but more likely a 16th ounce is your happy medium. It's really hard to get away from these for catching small bass anywhere, whether it's at a relative, like a medium-sized reservoir, like an American Horse or a Dripping Springs, a Cedar Lake, something like that. Not super big, but also not it's not a pond. Using baits, green pumpkin, red and black flake, something like this, something like a tube, or I love rooster tails. So like this box right here. This is actually a really good small bass box. This was one that I had from a fishing clinic that we did out on Barren Fork River with some different baits. But rooster tails, little mud bugs, tubes, and then some baby shad and some curly tail grubs. Like this is all you need to go small bass fishing. 16 inches and under, this is going to get the job done every day of the week. You may throw a couple of hard baits in there with it, but this is ideally what you're looking for. And the great thing about rooster tails, I'm going to favor this is a really good color, this kind of grasshopper color, but you get a little bit of chartreuse mixed in. Try to get that focused a little bit better, but something like that. This is just a generic Bass Pro inline spinner. Same with this. Yakima Baits, their brand is Rooster Tail. Then you have some other, MEPS, different types of inline spinners. But sticking with a olive brown chartreuse or orange. So we got our orange, we got our chartreuse, we've got our brown, and we've got our olive. But this is the great thing about inline spinners. Can't get any closer to the back of the bait than that. So often overlooked bait. People usually use them to target trout, but rooster tails are dynamite for largemouth bass, and especially the size class that we're looking to catch. So if you can build a box that looks something like this one and add in, a 1/8 ounce lipless crankbait, a couple of little build small baits, that's all you need. And that's going to fit right into your bag. You can fit that into a hoodie pocket. Minimizing clutter anytime you go fishing. Obviously, we've rifled through 30, 40 boxes here. You don't need that to go fishing. Everything here has a practical application somewhere, but overall, when you're going fishing, especially for a species like largemouth bass, and especially for largemouth bass that are going to be in that smaller size class, that 8 to 14 inches, it doesn't take much. You're looking at curly tail grubs, tubes, lipless crankbaits, build crankbaits, and maybe a topwater. And then throw in an inline spinner with that. Those are 6 baits that you can get in a couple of different colors, and you can put them in a box that is, like this. That fits right in. I like to try to I show this in most of my Asking Anglers and at my fishing clinics, but when I pond fish or go to small bodies of water, this is all I have is just a box that's this size. A couple of different weight and hook selections so I can switch it up. Stick worms that are like this small, so a 2 3/4 inch. Black and blue, I prefer something that's more of a green pumpkin, red and black flake. But these are Z-Man, Finesse TRDs. Young makes a real small one. Bass Pro makes I think theirs are called like Stickos or something. But they make one of those like 2.5 inch, and that's perfect. You put that into a little box that you can put this in your back pocket, your hoodie pocket, a backpack, a tote bag. It's just going to make fishing so much more enjoyable because not only are you going to find yourself having success, but you're not dealing with a bunch of stuff that you're probably not really going to use anyways. So you come away from anything from this on the fishing side of it is keep it small, under 3 inches. Probably keep it naturally colored. Green pumpkin is a hard one to beat, but green pumpkin, chartreuse, purple, red, maybe a white. Whites, especially if you're on bigger water and you're dealing with shad. But if you're not dealing with shad as a primary food source, then, purples, shades of purple, shades of watermelon, or green pumpkin is really all you got to focus on. You're going to get bit with those anywhere that you go. Some focusing on the backs of coves, marinas, anything that has hard structure as that vegetation's dying off, where they can corner in where fry were living. That's the thing with that bait fish bite in the fall. It's not that those bait fish weren't already in those same areas. It's that now that vegetation has died, those bait fish no longer have the cover that they had before. They can actively get got by those largemouth now by herding them together. So a lot of times in the fall, you'll hear about people saying schooling largemouth. Largemouth are typically solitary fish. So they're ambush predators. They hang out under a log. There might be a few fish in the same area, but they're not technically a school. They're not working in unison. When you get into the fall, they might not be technically working in unison. You'll see a school of maybe 4 or 5 bass swimming together and kind of working together. It's really just more of a byproduct of those fish know that at this time of year, they have easy access to shad and bait fish that no longer have cover. And so there's strength in numbers being able to force those fish up onto a bank or up onto a point or into the back of a cove, and they just take turns whacking at them. So anytime that you fish in the fall, you fish a pond, you fish any type of lake, and you can find a cove, just sit there and watch for a few minutes and see if you can't actually pinpoint exactly where those bass are actively feeding. Because more often than not, it's going to happen, especially in the prime time fishing hours, dawn, dusk. But you're going to see it happen throughout the course of the day. So with that, that kind of brings us through all of our baits. I have some fly fishing stuff. I don't know how interested anybody really is in fly fishing on this class. A lot of the same stuff though. Top water baits. So top water flies, here's a good top water box of just different types of foam bodied. You can use like Betts bass poppers. You're going to find those at most big retailers. But things with lots of appendages and same color schemes. So crawfish imitators, top water. You throw a nymph or of some kind. You might go with like some type of mayfly pattern, stonefly pattern, something like that. Beadhead, woolly buggers are great. Clouser minnows, any type of specialty articulated fly. Flies have gotten pretty advanced in the last decade as well. Just like the artificial tackle industry has more articulation, better hooks, and tungsten weights, things that just kind of take basic concepts that have always caught fish, and they're just building on those concepts to make it that much easier to get to those fish for more anglers. Let's see how fast you reel those in. I'm not sure which bait we were on when you asked that question, but my advice for any of these baits is just a steady retrieve. So you're not overly cranking and you're not slowing yourself down. So when you cast out any of these baits, when you cast out, it's just steady. You're not trying too hard to reel too fast, and you're also not forcing yourself to slow down. If you can find somewhere in between that, whatever your natural cadence of casting and reeling is, that's going to be perfect. Do those kinds of spinners really work for bass? I moved from Idaho. We used them for trout and smallmouth bass, but I never caught largemouth with them. Yeah, I grew up in the Pacific Northwest. I was familiar with rooster tails specifically for trout growing up. But yeah, from just personal anecdotal success, yeah, you find a lot of success with largemouth bass with using rooster tails, especially the more naturally colored ones. Your olive, usually labeled as frog, is typically the packaging on it. They have like hammered copper frog, from having the blade on it being hammered and being that color. That, or the grasshopper the brown one is usually called grasshopper, hammered copper grasshopper, something like that. Vidrick rooster tails give you a little extra flash, more of a conical shape as opposed to the cylindrical shape. But those are great. But you can get them on whites and blacks, chartreuses, oranges. But if you stick to the brown color or a green color rooster tail, that's what you're going to find the most success on for largemouth bass here in the state. Okay, so let's talk about our public access areas that we have. So the public access areas that were listed in the guide that I put at the very beginning of this, and most of you probably received with the email that got sent out on Tuesday. These are public area lakes that have been identified by our fishery staff through surveys over the past several decades of looking at the size structures of these fish, and determining that in these bodies of water, particularly, there is not just what we typically see, which is the majority of largemouth bass being between 8 and 14 inches, 6 and 14 inches, somewhere in there, but an overabundance of that where it's having a negative effect on the bass population's ability to achieve that maximum weight for certain fish. So that is, you can get stunting out of that, which is not good. When fish start to stunt, you're going to have lots of lingering problems. You can have bad year classes, fish develop bad eating habits. There's lots of different scientific evidence as well as anecdotal evidence, surveying evidence to suggest different reasons for different things. But the overall agreement is that having bass that are 8 to 14 inches being the predominant species that's in there, and especially for that species, it's going to cause problems. You're not going to be able to you're going to have a bad prey base. You're going to have fish that are going to get stuck at the same size, and you're not going to really be seeing any big fish. And then accompany that with the fact that we've had a 14-inch minimum as opposed to a maximum. Then all the fish that are legally being able to be taken out of those bodies of water were over 14 inches. So essentially you're stripping your trophy fish, and all of these fish aren't allowed to be caught, and they're the most abundant. So just in alphabetical order of what we have, what is it? Does the local city rules overrule the new rules? There's 13 on my local. So if it's more restrictive than what the state law is, check with the local municipality who owns the lake. But yes, it can be more restrictive. No city rule or lake operator rule that is a public body of water can ever be less restrictive than the state rules, but they can be more restrictive. You see that a lot with like sawguy and walleye in lakes that stock them because you don't have natural reproduction and things like that. But if there is stricter bass rules, you may check with them to see if they updated it with ours, but they can be more restrictive. They just can never be less restrictive. So if you ever go somewhere and it's like, it's a public body of water and you see a rule or a sign that is less restrictive than the state rule, call the county game warden because there's something wrong with that, but they can be more restrictive. So in alphabetical order, so in the northwestern part of the state, a department-owned area is American Horse Lake. American Horse Lake we redid a few years back. It was really designed to be kind of a trophy sunfish fishery. And so in order to build a trophy sunfish fishery, you do kind of need your bass not to be big. You kind of want them to be in that size range. And so in doing so, that is a good, close to Oklahoma City, great lake. You can put a boat on it, you can put a kayak, a float tube. There's some good bank access. There's not a lot, but there is some, decent bank access to that. But it has an overabundance of that eater size largemouth bass. So if you live in Oklahoma City, you're looking to get out of the city for a day, American Horse, depending on where you live in the metro, is going to be anywhere from 45 to an hour and 20 minutes away from you. And it's a good little spot, just right. You can go I-40 if you live North Metro, Edmond, Guthrie, Stillwater, you're just going straight west through over towards Kingfisher. So that's a good one that's close to the Oklahoma City metro. The next one's is Birch. And so with Birch, we're just kind of looking at a lake that, has been identified for a while as having, some smaller bass that are in them. Next one's going to be Bixoma. Bixoma we have up there again in the Northeast. A lot of these lakes are going to be up in the Northeast just because of there's a lot more water that direction. There's a lot more smaller bodies of water that direction. There's more opportunity for there to have this problem exist. Down south, southeast, bigger reservoirs, bigger water, less of this type of problem happening or having the overabundance. You get in the southeast, it becomes the other way. You start seeing a lot more big largemouth bass. So the northeastern part of the state is really ripe for the most amount of public areas in kind of a close proximity that have an overabundance of bass that you can get into. But again, if you own your own pond, you fish a neighborhood pond, city lake, you're helping out your own cause if you like to catch big fish by actively harvesting. So a good rule of thumb is anywhere between 20 and 35 pounds per acre of largemouth. So if that's your own pond, it's really easy because you should be the only one, or your family or your friends, what's getting taken out of it. At a city lake, you don't know as much, but we do know that bass typically aren't being caught. So you could probably go a little bit over that of how many fish you're keeping a year. So if you own your own pond, you got a 1 acre pond, you catch 20 to 35 1 pounders, 60 to 75 half pounders, and then quarter pounders, something like that. But you really, if you're doing it for your own management on your own body of water, where you want to start is find stunted fish first. If you find fish that look like they're in bad shape, they're a little malnourished, you're catching, 15, 16, 17, 18-inch fish that should be 3, 4, maybe even 5 pounds, and it weighs 1.5 pounds because it's nothing but skin and scales, take those fish out. Start there if you have those. And then from there, utilize these baits. Don't just target your trophy fish. Throw rooster tails, throw little tubes, throw little grubs. try to catch intentionally small bass and figure out of those actively feeding bass at the best times to fish a year, which are, we're coming up on that right now here in the next month, and then again in April, and figure out, what do I catch the most of? If you go out there and you catch 30 bass in a day, what was the most that I caught of what size range? If it was 9 inches, if you caught 18 9 inches out of the 30 you caught, that's the size that you want to be harvesting. Start with that. The 20 pounds that you're taking out that first year, take the 9 inches out. Then do the same, repeat that process year over year until you start seeing, oh, I caught a 6 incher, I caught a 14 incher, I caught a 21 incher, I caught an 18 incher, I caught a 4, you're mixing it up where you're seeing lots of good size structure, but you're also catching bigger fish each year, that maximum weight that you're achieving. And that's how you get not only a good healthy balance of your body of water, but you're going to allow for the best genetics in the pond to eventually try to achieve their maximum weight, which is usually the goal of most people when they have their own pond, especially if they have bass in them. If you have crappie, if you got catfish, if you got, you might have a lot of different wants. It's just here for the kids. It's just here for when I have friends over. But if you want to manage for bass to keep them not only healthy and keep good genes in, but you want to have the opportunity yourself to grow some lunker fish that, you can catch a couple times a year, that's going to be your best route to do it. Apply that same principle when you go to these public bodies of water, your local lake. If you fish with a bunch of people, you have a group of friends who go out and fish different parts of the lake. Do the same thing. What are we seeing a lot of? Man, we only catch 12-inch bass. Then start ripping those 12 inchers out and just keep doing it. Keep doing it until you stop catching those 12 inchers as frequently. And then maybe find a next class of fish and rip them out. And then bass is great. It's super easy to clean. If you go to the guide that I put at the beginning of the chat, or you go to wildlifedepartment.com, it's right there on the main page. There's cleaning and cooking tips on that. It's a little hard to discuss right here. I don't have a fillet table in front of me. I wouldn't be doing much good by just verbalizing it. But YouTube, the videos that we have on there from YouTube, you can find, any way that you could possibly fillet a bass with the tools that you have, you're going to find a video that's going to show you exactly how to do it. You can Google recipes. I like to cook fish 2 ways. I either, completely fillet them, no skin, no nothing, trim them off, usually soak them in salt water or milk for a couple hours or overnight. And then I'll either cut them up into chunks and I'll put them in just 99-cent Louisiana fish fry batter, spice it up a little bit with some garlic or some Slappy Mama sauce or Old Bay or any whatever your favorite seasonings are. Mix it into that batter, and then I throw them straight into like peanut oil. But any type of oil, cook them like that. Or I take the fillets, I put the fillets into a cast iron skillet or into a pan with some butter, and then I cook them a couple minutes on each side, and then I break them up and I do fish tacos. And I'll season them the same way that I would just without the Louisiana fish fry. So I'll do salt and pepper, and then some, I like spicy. So I'm usually like Slappy Mama or some cayenne, black pepper, things like that, mixed with some garlic and butter. And those are the 2 ways that I cook fish. I really don't cook fish any other way. So, but you might find something you like, and bass are just a super easy fish to do it on. And if you've never eaten bass before, because either one, you'd heard they're not any good to eat, that's just false. If you like crappie, catfish, or bluegill, you're not going to notice the difference. If anything, you might like them better than you thought you liked those other fish, or because you've heard, well, you shouldn't eat them or you can't eat them. These resources are here, for people to enjoy. And it's a big part of, who we are, is our harvest of wild game. Before we had farms, before we had grocery stores, it's a big biological and cultural part of, who people are, is, eating and catching and harvesting, the bounties of what the natural world has to give. So don't ever let somebody make you feel like, any of these resources that are legal for you to harvest, you shouldn't be because of, some reason. It was really just kind of a stigma that came about for bass because of professional bass fishing. and tournament fishing. And it was like, well, if we have everybody ripping fish out, there's not going to be any fish to catch. And when you're fishing for money, it becomes, a bit of the concern. So a lot of that exists with catch and release of trout. We live in a state where we don't have native trout. So they're put and take. It's a different mentality. But we live in a part of the country where bass fishing, we're one of the best bass fishing states in the country. From the Northwest all the way to the Southeast, we have great bass fishing across the state. It's why big tournaments come here every year. It's why most major manufacturers of fishing tackle are based out of Oklahoma. Major League Fishing is based out of Tulsa. So we are a very big primetime fishing state. So it's a big step in the right direction for the conservation agency of the state to say, in a scenario like that, where there's economic impact with these tournaments, with these big high dollars and all of this fishing equipment, to be able to say, listen, we're trying to make this fishing better. And the way that we're going to get there for tournament anglers to have the most success, for trophy anglers or people who like the opportunity to catch that big fish, we're going to get there by cleaning up some of the stigmas, the dogmas, bad regulations, or misguided regulations. You don't know what you don't know until you know it. And what we know is that having 8 to 14 inch bass, especially in smaller bodies of water, as the most prevalent fish is not good for any part of fishing, no matter who you are. So take advantage of this new rule this fall, and get out there and catch some fish. Let's see some more questions that are on there. Caught 16 bass, all under 16, except for one that was 4.5 pounds. Just making a comment, and of course, to throw them all back. So the question is now to us: you want us to keep those? Yeah. With this gear is driven towards keeping fish under 16 inches, but it's really geared towards keeping fish between 8 and 14 inches. That's where you're going to see the most abundance of fish. You're going to have lots of fish that are 6 to 8 inches, but you also want to get, a good portion of the fish. When you start cleaning a 6-inch fish, that's a little small. Now, if you're eating because you got to eat, there's no problem. But if you're not struggling for the food, but you like to eat the fish that you catch, that 8 to 14 inch range is going to give you the best fillets. They're going to taste the best. They're going to have the firmest meat to them, especially as we get a little bit colder water temps here. They're super easy to fillet. You get a nice chunk of meat off of them. And like I said, fish grow the fastest in the first few years of their life. That's the perfect size range to eliminate a lot of the elements and chemicals that are in the water that fish accrue through the food chain over time. So when you're eating fish in that size range, the detriment to your health long-term from eating a lot of those fish is lesser than if you were eating 16 and over bass, and those were the only bass you ate, and you ate them 5 times a month. Those fish are going to be much older, a lot longer time of accruing mercury and lead, and all the other different elements and minerals and then pollution that's in there. So it's also healthier for you as the person eating these fish to always try to eat fish that are really kind of in that cookie cutter size. Same goes for catfish. Eating a 10-pound catfish versus eating a 1.5-pound catfish, it doesn't have enough time to get there to, get some of those, possible health hazards that may be in them. So that's another added benefit of trying to stick to kind of that 8 to 14 inch range, on top of it. All right, that gets us through the questions. So the rest of, I've stopped at Big Soma. So the rest of our, good public access areas that we have, Carl Blackwell, that's a really good one, right up there in Stillwater. So kind of, you can get there from Tulsa, but it's, quick drive just up the road from Oklahoma City. So close to the metro. Carl Etling, that's kind of that's the outlier. Most people will never beat a Carl Etling in their life. It's up in Black Mesa and the very tip of the panhandle. Used to be a really good pike fishery. We've had issues with the dam over the last decade. So water level has really fluctuated. We've tried different strategies to kind of clean it up, to turn it back into kind of a destination fishery. But it currently is a lake that is overpopulated with small bass. Dripping Springs over there right next to Okmulgee Lake. So pretty easy access from anybody outside of Tulsa or the eastern half. If you live I-40, basically, if you're Shawnee east, Dripping Springs is a great place to go. It's a really cool area, good camping, cool part of the state, nice facilities around there. Hugo in the southeastern part of the state. So most people think of the southeastern part of the state as kind of our big bass capital, and Hugo is kind of that lake that's just in the middle of all that we've surveyed that is struggling with some of those undersized bass. But you could make, if you're a big time angler and you take a week off a year to go fishing, and you go down to McGee Creek or Broken Bow, Pine Creek, Cedar Creek, or Cedar Lake, you know, you may stop by Hugo and fill up your live well a couple of days and take home some fish. Kanawha is just southeast of Oklahoma City. It's a good one to get to from people, again, who live in the Oklahoma City metro, especially on the east side of the metro. So Norman, Noble, Little Axe, Tecumseh, Pink, Shawnee, even if you live in Edmond, Guthrie, not quite that far away. And McMurtry, right next to Carl Blackwell, those two lakes. McMurtry is a really nice camping area. So if you're looking for a retreat out of the Oklahoma City metro that is a little bit more in the woods than Arcadia Lake, you know, you just kind of want to get out of the city for a weekend. That's a great one. You know, it's 45 minutes up the road from the north end of the metro, and they have really nice facilities there and shops, and Stillwater's just down the road. So one of those places where you can still go camping or fishing with the family, but still have all the modern amenities around you. If you're not like a real primitive, you know, no amenities type camper or hunter or angler, McMurtry and Carl Blackwell are really good places that are just north of the metro. Then Skiatook and Stroud. So you live up 44 towards Tulsa. Skiatook is actually a pretty good little underrated smallmouth fishery. Not a lot of big smallmouth out of there. So that would be a good lake to do both largemouth and smallmouth, catching under 16 inches. Smallmouth are delicious. I mean, I think smallmouth are probably a little bit better than largemouth taste-wise. It's very hard to tell the difference. Smallmouth can sometimes just be a little bit less of a fish taste if you got a fish taste at all out of them. Sweeter, if you will, maybe a little savory, sweet, a little bit more. I have a soft spot for smallmouth bass. Anybody who's watched these before, so I'm not a huge advocate of eating smallmouth bass, but when they're in our lakes, they're not native fish, so I don't really have a problem with that. It's not a soft spot for me. If you get out and do our creeks and rivers, you can still only keep one smallmouth, and it has to be over 14 inches. I'd prefer you threw those back, but hey, that's the rule. So if you eat them, you eat them. But Skiatook's a good one if you want to mix it up for both smallmouth and largemouth. Murray is another one down next to Arbuckle. Great. You can catch a lot of little smallmouth out of that as well as largemouth. So two opposite ends of the state, Murray and Skiatook. If you want to switch it up and get smallmouth and largemouth mixed in and fill up your live well, those are two great options to go to. Murray State Park, good camping, good amenities. Skiatook, you're just outside of Tulsa. Lots of things to do around that, especially if you're not from the area. And then Lake Vincent, which is one of our department managed areas. Again, one of those that you probably won't get to unless you're the type of person who goes out to Ellis County to go hunting. Lake Vincent is on that property, and it's just a smaller lake that has just a ton of 10, 12, 14 inches in it. So that's a good one. If you're ever out there, you know, maybe you want to double up what you're doing. You go out there dove hunting or waterfowl or deer hunting and take some rods, go out there and have a little fish fry at your campsite. It's got good public access. It's on a WMA, so you can fish the entire thing on public property from the bank to what you can get to. And that takes us through those over time, but I'm here to answer questions if anybody's got anything. Who stocks the smallmouth in Texoma? I mean, we did at one point in time. We have not stocked smallmouth bass as an agency in a long time. It's been a long time since we've stocked smallmouth bass. Highly unlikely that Texas is stocking in. Smallmouth bass are notoriously difficult to hatchery raise. It takes very ideal conditions to grow them. So where we're at in this part of the country, it's very difficult to get a hold of smallmouth bass grown locally. So the smallmouth that are in Texoma were fish that were stocked, decades ago, and those are native wild fish now. They're native as in the fish now, they've been born here. They're introduced native, but they are wild fish. You're not catching fingerlings or fry that were stocked out there. To my knowledge, I wouldn't imagine that Texoma or that Texas Parks and Wildlife is stocking it with smallmouth, not anytime recently. Anything else? I think that brings us through. Big takeaway from this. Thanks, first of all. Can't do this without you guys. Everything that you guys do, I always try to reiterate, we're a non-appropriate by licensed dollars. So getting out and participating is what allows us to do management and educate and inform and, try to leave the resource in a little bit better shape than what we found it in. Then buying hunting and fishing equipment, it's also, that's what we get through federal excise, through our federal grants that we apply for. So anything that you do hunting and fishing related, it directly impacts us because we don't get tax dollars from the state. So it's really helpful when people are participating and engaged. Anything that we can ever do to help with, information that you want or anything that we can put you in touch with, that's what I'm here. If you ever got a fishing question, if I can't answer it, I'll do my best to point you to either the person or the people who are going to get you what you want and put you on the best path to having success. But as far as largemouth bass go, this is a really good opportunity for the state as the resource, and as well as for the fishermen and anglers and kids and the next generation coming up, that hopefully 20, 30 years from now, Oklahoma will be synonymous with bass management, with good practice, with anglers who we can make a regulation, but it's not going to pay the dividends that it can without active participation and going out there and harvesting these fish and making a concerted effort to fish for them. Because like I said, everything that I ran through today, you're going to catch bass left and right with anything that I showed here. But if you really size down your bait, focus on certain areas of the body of water where you're more apt to run into fish that are under 14 inches, and you do that, you're going to pay some major dividends on your own property. If you have a bass pond that you like to fish, you're going to see major improvement on your small bodies of water, your local lakes that you like to fish all the time. If you got buddies and friends and family, we're coming up here. Most people kind of start to get geared towards deer season, but if you're not a big hunter or you can split your time pretty evenly, October is, in my opinion, the best fishing month of the year as far as the type of fishing that you're doing, because it's really easy for anglers of all levels to find success with a multitude of species, but in particular largemouth bass, because they really start to key in on bait fish and bluegill and things like that actively. There's not the vegetative growth. You can power fish, which is always fun. Finesse fishing can burn people out. You tell somebody to go out and flip soft plastics all day, they might catch fish, but if they don't, they probably didn't have a lot of fun fishing slow and methodical. It's fun to just go out and filter water without filtering water when you're filtering the bass of fish's mouth. So get out there this fall. We appreciate y'all being here. Anything that I can do to help. If you got in here through the live session, just go to wildlifedepartment.com, go to the fishing resources page. My information's down at the bottom. If you signed up or you got the link through the email that you received on Tuesday, then you already have my information. So feel free to call, text, or email anytime, and I'll get you pointed in the right direction for fishing. So happy fall to everybody. Stay safe out there. Tight lines. Hope you fill up your fish fryers here starting on Sunday. And until next time, we'll see you. Enjoy.